Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. One of the consistent themes that we see running throughout Rainer Maria Rilke's letters to a young poet, which really could be letters to a potential poet or possible poet, this young man who's writing poetry and will also end up pursuing a military profession. One of the main themes is that of trust, and that's how it's often translated in English. The term that actually gets used over and over again, it's not wrong to translate it as trust, but it's a verb, halten, which literally means to cling to stick with, to cleave to, we could say, if we're going to use an older English word. And so there's a kind of active element to it. It's not trust in the sense of, oh, I don't have to do anything. There's this thing over there that's going to take care of me and I can be purely passive. There's an active and enduring, you could say, aspect to it. And I'm not going to say that the very first place we encounter it is letter 8, but that's one that we should look at because we see it coming up in letter after letter. And here the framing is not so much trust in things, die Dinge, but trust in what is difficult, das Schwere, right? So he's going to tell us that we arrange our life, and if only we arrange our life in accordance to the principle, Grundsatz. There he's actually using this as a technical term, principle, something that we would follow. And I really like the German term. Satz means proposition or sentence or something like that. And Grund, basic, at the foundation of things. So a principle is something that we govern ourselves in relation to. And what is this principle? He says that we must always trust in or cling to the difficult. Now, why would we do that? Well, because we are encountering a life, and as he talks about situations and society in which we're continually being offered the easy. He actually talks about the easiest of the easy. And we don't want to be seduced by that. If things are easy, not a problem. We don't have to reject it and say, oh, I must pursue the difficult for its own sake. But when things do become difficult, that's when we have the greatest possibility of encountering something more real, something more valuable, something that will allow us to transform. And interestingly, in this letter, in that section, he actually begins by talking about people being cowardly and rejecting the so-called spirit world, death, all of these things, Dinge, that are so closely related to us. And he says, through our daily defensiveness, these have been pushed out of life, that the senses with which we might have been able to grasp them have atrophied. And then he says, to say nothing of God, but fear of the inexplicable has not only impoverished the reality of the individual, it has narrowed the relationship between one human being and another, which has, as it were, been lifted out of the riverbed of infinite possibilities and set down in a place on the bank where nothing happens. And he goes on and talks about the things that scare us. Maybe really, in themselves, they're not that scary. He says, maybe all these ancient myths that stand at the beginning of all races, the myths about dragons that are at the last moment transformed into princesses, perhaps all the dragons in our lives are princesses who are only waiting to see us act just once with beauty and courage. Perhaps everything that frightens us is, in its deepest essence, something helpless that wants our love. So by trusting, by clinging to, by sticking with, by enduring, we can allow things to reveal their true selves to us. This is not the only thing that he has to say about this matter by any means. And if we go back to an earlier letter, number 7, we're going to see him talking about trust as well. So in letter 7, he's talking about Capus and his solitude, and he tells him it's clear we must trust in what is difficult. Again, we see this principle, right? We must trust in what is difficult. And here we get a kind of explanation or analogy that's being put forward. Everything alive trusts in it, what is difficult. Everything in nature grows and defends itself any way it can and is spontaneously itself, tries to be itself at all costs and against all opposition. And then he goes on and he says, we know little, but we must trust in what is difficult is a certainty, eine Sicherheit, something we can rely upon that will never abandon us, uns verlassen, leave us behind, leave us, you could say, in the lurch, to use one of our English expressions. So if we stick with what is difficult, we're not going to lose out, which is our great fear that motivates us. And so he goes on and he says, it is good to be solitary, for solitude is difficult. And we'll come back to that in a moment. Solitude is one of those great things, as he calls them. Now, in letter 4, we get another interesting discussion of trust, and here it is, trust in things. So he's talking about writing from Paris, actually having left Paris and being on this great northern plain, and he says, there's a problem that you have to deal with, a problem that you have to figure out, a question and feeling that have a life of their own. And even the most articulate people won't be able to help, right? And he says, I think you will not have to remain without a solution, an Auflösung, a resolution to these matters, if you trust, again we have that word halten, in things. What kind of things? Like the ones that my eyes are now resting upon. The German term there is ähnlich, those that are similar to it. He is seeing the landscape and the matters of nature, and he's saying, you don't have to see the same panorama that I do, but things that are of the same kind. So nature itself, being in nature, if you trust in nature, in what is simple in nature, in the small things that hardly anyone sees and that can so suddenly become huge, immeasurable. So not just that we look at a pine cone or, a fly or the way in which the snow is falling off of a spruce tree or something like that, and suddenly it becomes big because it occupies our vision. It becomes unmeasurable, uncomparable to other things. It occupies us. We have attentiveness towards it. And he says, if you have this love for what is humble, and try very simply as someone who serves to win the confidence of what seems poor, then everything will become easier for you, more coherent, and somehow more reconciling. Not in your conscious mind, perhaps, which stays behind, astonished, but in your innermost awareness, awakeness, and knowledge. And here he's got one of his wonderful lines going on that doesn't have to do so much with this theme of trust, but does in some way connect with it. He says, I would beg you, as well as I can, to have patience with everything unresolved in your heart and to try to love the questions themselves as if they were locked rooms or books written in a very foreign language. Don't search for the answers, which could not be given to you now because you would not be able to live them. The point is to live everything, live the questions now. Perhaps then someday far in the future, you will gradually, without even noticing it, live your way into the answer. So you could say that there's a different kind of trust being called upon there. We are to trust these things of nature, which we think of as outside of ourselves, but we're also to trust what is within us, the very processes, and the fact that our conscious minds aren't containing all of the answers to this. A little bit later on in letter 4, he's going to talk about bodily delight and how we've transformed it into something more superficial. And he says that all beauty in animals and plants is a silent, enduring form of love and yearning. The solitary man can see the animals as he sees plants, patiently and willingly uniting and multiplying and growing, not out of physical pleasure, not out of physical pain, but bowing to necessities that are greater than pleasure and pain and more powerful than will and withstanding. If only human beings could more humbly receive this mystery which the world is filled with, even in its smallest things, could bear it, endure it more solemnly, feel how terribly heavy it is, instead of taking it lightly. And now, so that's other things. He goes on as well and says, if only they could be more reverent toward their own fruitfulness, to guard their own fruitfulness, then they would be freed towards this possible creativity, this rapture, right? That goes beyond mere bodily delight. What a wonderful way of thinking about things. In letter 6, we're going to see a very important discussion. He's writing his interlocutor again, and his interlocutor has presumably been worried about the superficiality, the conventionality of the situation that he's been placed in. And Rilke tells him there isn't any that is in itself vast and spacious and connected to the important things, the grossen, the great things, right? That the truest kind of life, or if we want to stick closer to the German, the actual life, real life, as we call it, often contrasting it against conventional life, wirkliche, right? Lebens, is connected with. And he goes on and tells us that only the individual who is solitary can actually have this. Only the individual who is solitary is placed under the deepest laws, like a thing. Now, this is not a resorting to mechanism or something like that, because things themselves are animate, have a kind of intentionality. As a matter of fact, in another place, Rilke will talk about the things coming out to meet us. And what are these things? Well, he tells us, if there's nothing that you can share with other people, try to be close to things. They will not abandon you. Again, we see this theme of you can trust in things. And the nights are still there, and the winds that move through the trees and across many lands. Everything in the world of things and animals is still filled with happening, which you can take part in. And children are still the way you were as a child, sad and happy in just the same way. And if you think about your childhood, you once again live among them. This echoes the advice that he gave in the very first letter, telling his interlocutor to go into the depths of your childhood that you still contain within yourself. Trust in it, right? Now, what are the great, serious, important, difficult things? Solitude is one of them. This is a key theme as well, not only in these letters, but so many of other letters addressed to other people by Rilke. But he's also going to talk, and this is going to be in letter 6 and in other letters as well, about love. Right? And he's going to talk about this even more in 7. So he says it's good to love because love is difficult. For one human being to love another human being, that is perhaps the most difficult task that has been entrusted to us, the ultimate task, the final test and proof, the work for which all other work is merely preparation. And he says, young people, they're not ready for that. You have to age and mature, and not everybody who ages and matures is going to do this. And this is the letter in which we find that love is two solitudes protecting each other. But what else? Death. The death of those we care about, the death we encounter, the death that will inevitably take all of us. To be dead is not fully to be dead for Rilke, and we could talk about that in other poems and letters, but it is something that we have to face. It is one of these difficult, heavy things that we can encounter and come to embrace within our solitude. God. Rilke has some very interesting ideas about what God is, and tells his interlocutor, you probably have never had the God you think you lost. God is something that we are building, like flies gathering honey. So that's another thing. You see that there's the simple, small things of nature or of our own memories, but there's also these massive, we could say, metaphysical matters. And I would say that the relationship between one human being and another, whether it's love or other modalities, also figures into this panoply of things that we are being called to have trust in. Friendship, companionship, perhaps even rivalry or misunderstanding. Provided we adopt this attitude of trust, of sticking with things, we can experience a much greater and richer life. Whether we can actually communicate that with other people, the degree to which they can share in it, model themselves after our own, that's an entirely contingent matter, as Rilke realizes. But it is certainly something that we can talk about, as he has in these letters, that we can reflect upon and think about. And once we have an inkling of it, something that we can desire for ourselves and then put into practice within our own lives.